of the book of Colossians, going through the book verse by verse. We'll get started in about a minute and a half. So go grab yourself a second cup of coffee, and we'll get going shortly.
Sounds like rain.
And I don't know what to make of the. Hope the stream is working all right. Phil, you're just, I'm putting you on mute. Like I said, I hope I sound all right, but you're very, very scratchy. All right, well, it's 9 o'clock. Let's get going. So, Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this day. We ask your blessings on it in Jesus' name. And Holy Spirit, we ask that you inspire understanding of these words in Colossians. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So everything's going crazy this morning. I'm hoping the stream is all right. My free conference call line is all scratchy, and my watch every couple seconds is.
What is this?
That's what I said, what's going
That's
on?
weird.
Okay. So
Are you revived?
Yes,
Wow.
Okay.
You go home and crash.
yes.
okay.
Indeed.
Let's see. We'll wait for Debbie to come back in.
You're gonna pray for me. I have Beckett today till Thursday. They haven't that's my grandson that has issues, and he can be triggered very easily. They have an opportunity for my daughter and her husband to go. They need to go.
Okay.
So
So-
I'm going to have the whole family, but he's in school, so kindness, negotiating, and redirecting.
Okay.
Lord, give me kindness, because if you don't have kindness, he erupts. So kindness, and then
Soft voice.
and then negotiating with him, so I need those things. But that's not the way I parented. So it's a whole new ball game.
Oh wow.
But I see things that we missed. I hope you do. But
All right.
Lord, be with me. Success.
All right. Well, let's get into Colossians. I don't know where everybody is today. This is unusual. I mean, but whatever.
It
All right.
is unusual.
Yeah. So it's said Eric. Things are happening today. My watch, like I said, is just for those of you who are on the stream. This is what my watch is doing.
That's just really good.
So
Maybe your watch is a
I'm wondering if there isn't maybe a possibly a solar storm that's hitting, because that will do strange things.
What?
But anyway, well, so a solar storm is
Oh,
where.
solar, yes.
All right, so we're in Colossians chapter 3, verse 18. It says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord." And one of the things that when you get into a section like this, I mean, this is obviously in today's culture is incredibly controversial. But the interesting thing is, it's also a theme. I mean, if this was a one-time appearance where Paul just here says this, one could say, well, he was writing it to the Colossians, but we were in Ephesians, and in Ephesians he said the same thing. And the interesting thing about both Ephesians and Colossians is that Paul is just writing to these churches. He is writing instruction. He's not dealing with a problem. He's just saying, "Hey, I've never been there, and I'm writing to you this treatise and so forth." So there's a formality about what he is writing here. It's also a theme that is picked up in Titus and so forth. So it's one of those things where you can read it and whether you like it or not, this is something that Paul writes, and therefore we have to take it seriously. One of my own, a testimony of Stephanie and I is that when we were young Christians in the 70s, I became a Christian in 1970. Stephanie was 72. We got married in 74, and we were in Bible churches, and they taught this, right? So we're on the cusp of of feminism, of the rise of feminism in this country, you know, and basically we were part of the culture that was emerging into these new things, and we consciously decided to go with this, So I now have, since this is Stephanie and I met in 72, so now we're talking about some 51 years, of being oriented to these scriptures. And I'm here to tell you that the word of the Lord is good. That, and therefore that's one of those sections where the culture would like me to be defensive, would like me to hold back, would like me to waffle and things like that. And I'm not going to do that. All right, so we're going to go with this. Now, when we get to slaves, I am going to take a bunny trail. I think I've covered it before, but it's important because one of the things that you will hear slammed at the church today is that the Bible never condemns slavery, right? And I mean, never mind the fact that to support our cell phones, we've got a bunch of child labor, mining things like that. So we'll ignore that for the moment and take the what the culture says to the church and say, and just ask the question, is it true? And
I think that the term, I think that the term probably slavery has been transformed in meaning since its biblical dimension.
there's aspect too, but we're actually going to answer the question. What is God's opinion of slavery? So, so Lucy.
And when we're talking about this, the thing that I see is that, like the wives be subject, we do not understand authority. And that God has given each of us authority for
Yes.
what He has put in us, but He also has authority in that
Right.
He's got, and we don't recognize the value of authority and the place of authority, the function of authority.
Yeah.
So it's an authority issue.
It is. It is. And let me give another personal testimony. I don't speak of this much. The place is going to go unnamed. Okay, I can tell you it's not Cobb Vineyard. So, but the place is going to go unnamed. But I was there, and I was given the opportunity to teach. So they said, you have 16 weeks to teach the book of Isaiah. Well, okay, well, 16 weeks, 66 chapters. I mean, how hard can this be? But anyway, I'm teaching through, and then the leader of the church said, so the next time my wife is going to teach, and it's a mixed group, okay? And there's one of the things they've got to Paul yet where he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. So I went to the leader and I presented this to him. And he said, no, my wife's going to teach. Okay. You know, fine. I said, well, it's while she's teaching, Stephanie and I are not going to come to the class. No, we're not going to make a big deal. We're not going to announce what we're doing or so forth. We're just not going to come. That was the last time that I taught at that place. Not only that, but I mean, there would be people that would say, hey, Don, could you lead this up? And the leader would find out about that, call that person into the office and say, you're not to do that. I mean, it was, actually became persona non gratis in the church. But here's the testimony side of this, because I bring this up because you talked about authority, right? I'm under that leader's authority. And I was thinking the fact, that I am being asked to experience what some wives, what some women experience, which is an authority, which is in a sense abusive and so forth. But I will be under that authority. I will respect that authority and so forth. It was just a way of saying, okay, I'm going to live what I teach. Um, it, I'm no longer at that place. But the thing is, I was for several years. And, and the interesting thing is, I still had an impact, because, I mean, just, anyway, be that as it may. Um, when we come to here, wives, be subject to your husband, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. And in all of these things, whenever Paul brings this up, it is always two-sided. It is the wives be subject, but husbands love. And when we were in Ephesians, it was husbands love your wives as Messiah loved the church and gave himself up for her. There really is a sense where, um, in the means of things, Stephanie just has to obey me if I ever commanded her to do anything.
Drink this latte.
um, on the other hand, I'm to be the one who takes the bullet, right? Right. So I mean, let's say who's more valuable here? Who's expendable? When you look at these verses, who is the expendable side of this equation? Right. But children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. So it's this double-sided thing, which is basically, all right. So here, um, if we were to think, what is the underlying principle here? What is the underlying value of going along with this, especially when we live in a culture that is going, oh, crazier than I ever thought I'd ever see, right? It goes all the way back to the very first commandment. Do you know what the first commandment is? I mean, the very first commandment in the Bible. Genesis chapter 1. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Let us make man in our image. Male and female, he created them. I mean, suddenly in that verse, the Godhead becomes plural, creates the man and the woman in God's image. And since God is multiple persons in one God, so the one flesh union between the man and the woman in the family mirrors that one flesh relationship. So the reason that Paul and the others in the scriptures talk so much about family dynamics is because the family is the very first thing that God had in mind when he created man and woman. And it is the integrity of the family. If you want to know when this nation was strong or when any nation is strong, it is when their families are strong, right? And therefore we have a vested interest in strong families. But I was not alive during World War II, but my father was in it, and many of our parents were in it. And the thing is, like they volunteered. to go there. There was a sense where we have to get this done. But I'll tell you that they are not so much getting it done because our government is so good. They're getting it done because they do not want their families to live under what they are fighting. All right, it is a family thing. I am I'm the soldier because I am protecting my family. You take that away, and you know I'm going to die for the Republican Party. I'm going to die for the Democrat Party. I'm going to die for a government that is. I mean, the thing is, like, I'm not going to die for the government. You can say I'm going to die for my country, but that's not what you're dying for. The thing, I began this with my testimony of Stephanie and I back in the 50s. I'm sorry, 50 years ago, back in the 70s, where we decided that we were going to go along with these principles. It was at a time when feminism and humanism and so forth were rising. But what we have seen over the last 50 years is the deterioration of the family. And we're at a point now where I've heard it said that pets are the new children,
Yes.
right? Um, and and our young people are not having children. There are This country in certain areas actually now has a negative birth rate, meaning that people are dying faster than new people are coming in. And it is there is a demographic um, calamity, just over the hills, because in Western societies, as feminism has arisen and so forth, birth rates have fallen. They have fallen below um, replenishment, and it's serious, and it's all because we turned our eyes to different things. So
So
go ahead.
I'm not gonna do the mic for this one, because one of our kids got a cat, one of our younger kids, and said, here's your grand cat, picture of him. And I said, oh, you're gonna have to do better than that. But I will take it for this.
Okay.
But, when you think about how complicated this world is and how difficult it is, you can almost understand why they don't wanna have kids. I mean, nothing is fixed, nothing is, there's just, I can, and then if they themselves are believing some of the woke stuff, for a better word for it, then they're even more confused, what's a woman, all this stuff. I really can't imagine wanting to bring children into that. So, anyway, you can kind of, as much as I don't like that they're not having kids, you can, in one way, almost understand it.
When we felt that the Lord had called us to trust Him as far as to having children.
Right.
But one of the things, one was, I desire godly offspring,
Yes.
Malachi. But the other was Jeremiah, when they were taken to Babylon, telling them, build houses,
Yes.
have children. Because my thing was, who wants to bring, even then, who wants to bring a child into this world? And especially now, I could
Yeah,
feel that.
yeah.
But here was the prophet telling them, have children. So that was one of the things that that the Lord ministered to us, that brought us freedom to say yes.
Right.
We were talking about the pets. So you can rip a baby out of its mother's womb or suck its brains out as long as it's not fully out the birth canal, but don't touch an eagle egg or
Yeah.
an endangered turtle egg. I have friends on Facebook that are vegans, and that's fine if you want to be a vegan, but they go crazy, like they won't wear anything that's made from leather or any kind of animal products, and so it's really upside down.
It is. Right.
As far as that.
Quite true. So anyway, like I said, this is all to say I don't apologize for these sections, and there's great wisdom here.
Absolutely.
Right. All right. So, but anyway, but it's back and forth. It's like wives and husbands. and you know, Paul Paul doesn't dwell on the one side; he dwells on both sides. And again, fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart. Slaves in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Messiah whom you serve. For he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong he has done, and that without partiality. Okay, so now notice he spends a lot of time on slaves, and he's basically saying, if you are a slave, do your work as unto the Lord. I mean, now your master is coming along, he's telling you what to do, but you are to say, okay, my master, my earthly master has told me to do this, but I need to treat this as if Jesus is telling me to do this, and do it as unto the Lord, and expecting Jesus to have the reward. Now, I want to take a bunny trail, um, because this is important, because it is one of those things. I don't have the video staged up, and I don't have it connected up there, but one of Obama's um, bullying czars. I have a video of him in a high school talking about, he was gay, and the gays were being bullied and things like that. So, and this is a section where he begins the Bible, right? So he is talking about anti-bullying, and he says the Bible, and he says, the Bible never condemns slavery. It condemns eating shellfish. I mean, it goes to all of these commandments and things like that, but basically says, you know, it never condemned slavery. And yet we're going to listen to it when it condemns homosexual behavior. All right. Now, this is a serious charge. I mean, it is something that we have to have an answer for. And the way I'm a ponder, right? So I pondered the answer to these things. You know, and I found something rather extraordinary. Now, it has to do with something I teach, which is the fourfold division of the Torah. Okay, the laws, there's four categories of laws in the Old Testament. And the first category is the moral code. And the moral code are those things that are right and wrong for all cultures for all time. And therefore the commandment, do not commit murder, is something we're not free to, just because we're Christians, we're not free to commit murder now. Right? Because murder is a moral code. We are free to love, because that's righteousness. But that moral code of murder and theft and adultery and things like that, they remain wrong, because it's moral code. The second one, which I'm going to spend a little more time on, I'll cover all four, but we're going to come back to this one, which is the Civil Justice Code. And these are laws that, meditating on them, train us in the principles of justice. And that's why they're important. Because, a good government is a just government. And therefore, these laws, if we model our justice system on these laws, we will tend to be a just society. Then we have the priestly code, which is, you mess up, what do you do to get back to God? And Jesus is our new high priest, and therefore we don't need the temple sacrifices in Jerusalem anymore. We have a new high priest. We have a new priestly code that's in effect. And then you have the separation code, which is for the Jews only. Even when you get into the Old Testament section, tell the sons of Israel. The separation code begins with that. Tell the sons of Israel. It's not tell humanity, it is tell the sons of Israel, don't eat this. Circumcise your children and sons, and so forth. That's the separation code. All right, so the Civil Justice Code. Like I said, this is, and we are going to go to and I'm going to go to some things in the Civil Justice Code that have to do with slavery. And the first place I'm going to go is actually this verse here, Exodus 21:16. And it reads like this: He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. Southern slavery was based on kidnapping. Blacks, Africans were kidnapped in their own country, actually by their own people, and sold to us. So this one verse undercuts the entire system of slavery that existed in the United States because it was based on kidnapping. Okay, all right, but we're going to go to. I'm going to read a commandment, and you're not going to like it. I guarantee you're not going to like it. Okay, it is going to cut into your sensibilities. I mean, this would be the verse that the Obama's bullying czar would have quoted. Okay, so I'm going to read it, and I'm going to tell you that it is okay to be upset at this. Okay, now, it's going to be Exodus 21:1. And you need to understand that it is the Lord speaking. Okay, it is not Moses speaking, it is the Lord who's speaking this. Because it says, because the Lord is speaking. Now, these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you 6 years, but on the seventh he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of his wife, then his wife shall go out with him. So far, so good, right? If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. Okay, yeah. I mean, this is where this gives meat to this notion that the Bible does not condemn slavery. I mean, because this is hard. And the Lord, again, the Lord speaking this. Okay, so but if the slave plainly says, "I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man," then his master shall bring him to God. Then he shall bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. Okay. Now, like I said, there's not a. I mean, this catches in our crawl as it should. But this is what I want to point out again. This is the Civil Justice Code, and we're dealing with how it trains us in principles of justice. So I want you to go now to Deuteronomy 15. A generation has passed, and in Deuteronomy 15, we're going to go to verse 12. This is a generation later. And it is the same situation. It begins this: if your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you. Right? Notice that there's now suddenly a change. If a kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you. So we've now expanded it to men and women. Then he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall set him or her free. When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. Now remember, back in the first generation, he'll serve you 6 years and he goes out with nothing. Now all of a sudden, we've expanded it to men and women, and we're now saying you don't send him out empty-handed. He serves you 6 years, not going to send him out empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor and from your wine vat. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. Okay. You send him out with payment. Okay. Now, let me ask you the question: if someone, if you buy someone's services for 6 years and send them out with payment, is it slavery? It's like a 6-year contract, unbreakable 6-year contract. All right. Goes on. And then he says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this today. And then it shall come about if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you. Then you shall take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your servant forever. And also you shall do likewise with your maidservant." Now, here's the point, all right? This is civil justice code. It is to train us in the principles of justice. And the principle that I see here is justice very often is a matter of what you can do. Okay, and I'll submit to you that the brilliance of the Exodus 21 commandment was you don't have permanent slaves. Okay, and you think about, you're speaking to a culture that has permanent slaves, and you say, okay, I the Lord am commanding you no more slavery at all. No one's going to do that. No one's going to do that. So you go to how much can I push the envelope? You're slaves. You set them free after 6 years. The guys, you get to keep the girls. Okay. It's not everything, but it's a change. And once that change is in place, then the next generation you come along and say, oh, we're going to loosen up a little more. It is men and women. Oh, and by the way, you got to save up while they're serving you. You got to be saving up, because when they go out, you have to supply them liberally. That's the word, liberally, from your flocks and your wine vats and so forth. You're going to send them on their way so that they can set themselves up. Okay. Let me just say another side of this. There were no jails in Israel. Okay. If you stole money, okay, first of all, if you killed somebody, you were, there was this blood avenger that the family of the person you killed had a right to your life, and there were cities of refuge where you could flee to, and then they would hold a trial, and if they determined that it was manslaughter, that was an accidental death, you got to stay in the city. Okay, if it was determined that it was a premeditated killing, they open the doors and they kick you out, and the blood avengers on the outside, and they take you out. But here again, the city of refuge is not a jail. You get to have a family, you get to have a business, you get to live. Our system of justice takes you out for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You're in jail for 20 years and you come out, you've lost 20 years of what it takes to build a life for yourself. And I read the Civil Justice Code, and I look at this system of slavery as something that says, well, a thief, they become a slave for 6 years. And they're in the context of a family. And maybe, because they are a slave, they learn a little bit about what it means to work hard and to, basically it becomes a redemptive thing. And if at the end of 6 years you're sent out liberally, then you get to set up. You see where this is something that integrates and builds up society. And so when I talk about the Civil Justice Code and meditating on the Civil Justice Code, it is this kind of thing. It is malleable. It's changeable. Right now, abortion is still raging in this country. Okay, Roe versus Wade is gone. Okay, and there are some Republicans and who are in a sense passing laws that absolutely forbid abortion, and that is potentially a good thing, except that it may be pushing things too far. See, this is what I'm learning here is like, yes, the ultimate goal would be that there would be no abortions whatsoever. But what's possible? And in terms of what's possible, how many extra lives can we save? This goes all the way back, again, in the 70s when, Roe versus Wade first came about. And the pro-life movement back then, you know, it was all or nothing. And what do we end up with? Nothing. Okay. But look at this, slavery, and look at the first commandment in the first generation, the commandment in the second generation, and say, let's be incremental. Justice sometimes is incremental, and it is okay to be incremental. That's, again, you see what I'm saying in terms of meditating on the civil justice code trains you in justice, in the principles of justice. And sometimes it's not absolute. Miriam, could you get the microphone?
So it occurred to me, and I never thought of it from this direction before while you were teaching, that we are called to be uh, servants of the Lord. And the scripture talks about slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness. And so if we have this role as a servant to the Lord, how would we view that if there was no mechanism, there was no structure for righteous handling of a servant?
Right.
And, I mean, a bunch of thoughts came to me, but this is today, if you have a really hardened, willful, sinful person that's been accused or convicted of a crime, and you give them a choice: do you want to sit in a jail and do nothing, or do you want to go and serve in this way or work off? You know, it's a choice of character in a sense to go work to pay off your
Mm-hmm.
versus to sit and raise havoc for those who are the jailers,
Yes.
constantly plotting escape or evil or violence against someone around you. I guess this is, and then with abortion or with slavery, well, Israel in its sense was a theocracy, or was it? I mean, it was under God, but we're not a theocracy. We're a nation founded
Right.
by believers. But if we, I would hate for one abortion to happen, but if we are not a theocracy, can we legislate against hate
Right.
or against meanness or against every step of sin there is in the
Right.
possibilities of human action?
Yeah, I mean, and that's just it. You cannot. I remember my dad, when my little kid, he's saying you can't legislate morality. It's because law doesn't change hearts. You know, the gospel changes hearts. But and again, that's why we need to look at this in terms of justice as opposed to, in other words, we can't elevate a commandment in the civil justice code and raise it to the status of moral code. We have to say, okay, and that's also why where if our leaders, or even if we as we pursue the concept of justice, if we meditate on this, and here's what we have to do. Let's take slavery. I mean, let me start with an ox. Okay, if an ox gores your neighbor, okay, anybody here have any oxen in their backyard?
No.
Okay, but we do drive cars, right? And we do sometimes we're careless and we forget to put the parking brake on and we leave the car in neutral and it rolls down the hill and does some damage to a person even. Okay. Well, that commandment, if an ox gores your neighbor, okay, so here we have this particular, we bring it up here, we extract the principles and we bring it down here and we apply it to today. Okay. Slavery. Okay. Okay. I used to work for my medics. Okay. I mean, I worked for them, they paid me, but they told me what to do. Actually, they didn't tell me what to do. I discovered what they needed and just did it, right? But nevertheless, it was like I'm working as unto the Lord. It's they are my employer, but there's like the principles of being a slave to my employer is the same as or being an employee to an employer is the same as being a slave to a master. In the same way, if you own a business and you are hiring people, um, what Paul says about about masters, being kind and being generous and things like that apply. So that's again the principles of justice that we look at and we say there's application here. Debbie.
Yeah, I'm going to try to put my brain around this one because I'm trying to make a point related. I don't know if anybody's been following that middle Georgia coach this week. Um, he has been a highly acclaimed coach um, with many athletes parachuting into better athletes. But he came out specifically and went viral on the unbelievable racial comments about Atlanta and the ugliness of his words are just horror. There's no way that this man is going to say, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean."
Yeah.
So you put that kind of that's not a. It just didn't come over him to have these feelings. Every person that has been influenced by this man in good ways automatically not is him because of his ugliness. Then when you take it, it's not only about the black people. When you know that it's meant that he has elevated himself to a place of ownership of having these opinions. And it's not just necessarily when you have those opinions about one race, they're pretty much against women, the whole shebang. So I think that back in biblical days, I think servanthood might have been more like meaningful to be, well, I'm going to hire somebody to do the work in my backyard, right? It never meant to get distorted and out of place.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you talked about how it changed in that generation, I wonder what happened during that generation where it was under the formal rule to make the changes in the second generation.
Yeah, but here's the sad thing. Okay, um, let's go to Jeremiah. And you might say that all right, Jeremiah 34. I might call this the rest of the story, but it also illustrates the Lord's heart concerning this commandment that he has concerning slavery. And while you're turning there, let me just say this. When Paul refers to himself as a bondservant, a bondslave, he is referring to those servants who said, I'm well off with my master, I love his family, I want to be a slave forever, and the all is slammed to his ear. So it is someone who says, I am a bond slave. All right, so here's the situation in Jeremiah 34. Nebuchadnezzar is coming to Jerusalem, and he is going to take over the city. So in verse 8, 34:8, the word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people who were in Jerusalem to proclaim release to them, that each man should set free his male servant and each man his female servant, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, so that no one would keep them, a Jew his brother, in bondage. You know what this is saying? nobody was obeying the Deuteronomy commandment, right? Because I mean, this is human nature, right? There is a law in the books that says set them free after 6 years, send them out liberally, and nobody's doing it. So here Nebuchadnezzar is coming down, right? And all of a sudden, King Zedekiah gets his bright idea and says, maybe we should obey this commandment, right? But afterward, they turned around and took back the male servants and the female servants whom they had set free and brought them into subjection for male servants and for female servants. So they said, hey, you can go free. Oh, never mind. All right. I mean, it's human nature here. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, thus says the Lord God of Israel, I made a covenant with your forefathers in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, saying, at the end of 7 years, each of you shall set free his Hebrew brother who has been sold to you and has served you for 6 years, and you shall send him out free from you. But your forefathers did not obey me or incline their ear to me. Although recently you had turned and done what is right in my sight, each man proclaiming release to his neighbor, and you had made a covenant before me in the house which is called by my name, yet you turned and profaned my name, and each man took back his male servant, and so forth. Let me just cut to the chase. When they released their servants, Nebuchadnezzar turned around. When they talked them back, Nebuchadnezzar turned around and came back to Jerusalem. Okay, there are two commandments that are in the Torah that actually would have which would have spared Judah from the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar. The first one was when Jeremiah said, shut your gates on the Sabbath. The second one is this one. You set your slaves free according to the word of the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar turned around. And then you took them back. And Nebuchadnezzar is now coming with a vengeance. Now, like I said, the charge is levied against the scriptures that they have nothing to say about slavery. And I mean, the thing is, it's like this isn't a 5-second soundbite. It takes development, right? It takes, oh, I got to look at this. I got to look at this. I got to draw principles from this. And then I have to go to Jeremiah to show how important it is to the Lord. But the thing is that slavery was not on the mind of God. And again, we began with, if anyone kidnaps a man, so I mean, that notion that the scriptures have nothing to say about slavery is just wrong. It's just that slavery, yes. It's just that slavery is, I mean, okay. The thing that we need to understand is that England and the United States, England was able to do it without bloodshed. The United States, it took a civil war. But we are the only nations that eliminated slavery within us. But you look at sex slavery, you look at the slavery that is in China and other places concerning getting the minerals that we need for our phones and electric cars and things like that. Slavery in history is the norm. It is not the exception. It is the norm. And it is the Christians who in England and the United States that worked to abolish slavery, and it was the Christians that did it. That is the anomaly. And therefore, when the scriptures are speaking to slaves, they're speaking to what is throughout the centuries, and in a sense always will be until Messiah is reigning as king, the norm. So, but anyway, yes.
In the Bible, depending on different translations, different verses, it seems to use the term servant and slave interchangeably. And it may be that more of a modern definition. I tend to think of a servant as someone who has a choice. We don't see that a lot in this country, but like the old estates in Europe, they
Yes,
had
yeah.
butlers and chauffeurs, and they would call it being in service. It was a choice, and they could leave. Where a slave was more like owned as
Yes.
property. So is that just a modern change in how we use that? Because
Well, I
it,
mean,
they use it interchangeably in the Bible.
I don't know that it's that interchangeable. What you have in the scriptures are the hired men, you know, the hirelings and so forth, day laborers and so forth. And but the slaves were property; they were owned. Just like in this country, you know, the slaves on the plantations were owned; they were property. And I mean, the Southern slaveholders did the terrible things like separating families, selling the husband and leaving, you know, or selling the wives and things like that. And the sad thing is they went to places like Exodus 21 that says, hey, you know, he goes out, you get to keep the wife and the kids. You know, I mean, it's, and again, it just irritates our sensibilities, and they should. But again, this gets to the principle of one of the things about justice is what can you do? You know, what can you do in this generation, and how do you incrementally make the change in the next generation? Let me tell you, the left knows that principle because in my entire life it has been the left pushes and it creates too much friction, so they back off for 5 years, and they push again, and they back off, and they push again, and they push again, and they push again. They understand the principle of of incremental change, and we don't. You know, and it's because we tend to just want all or nothing. We don't understand the principle of incremental change, and we need to. And it's biblical. See, this is the interesting thing. This is what those two commandments side by side tell me is that it's biblical to incrementally change society to move towards perfection rather than demand perfection that is not achievable. So, I mean, I'm on a horse, but I mean, um, it was, quite frankly, it was back in when I first encountered it, Exodus 21 was back in the 80s. You know, I was asked to teach a community Bible chapel, and it just so happened that the next thing to teach was Exodus 21. And I read that commandment, and I said, oh my goodness, what do I do with this? The Lord speaking, right? It is the Lord. You cannot say that it's not God speaking, and it is a terrible commandment. I mean, I'm not going to go out. Let's say in front of, you know, Thomas says, "Hey Don, you want to teach some?" Sure. And then I teach this and say, you know what? We need more slaves, right? Um, and I said, okay, so what? And the thing is like you have to take the character of God. You have to take what we know from the rest of the scripture and say, what do I do with this? And at that time I did not know about the Exodus 15 side. I just had that. But I wrote, and what I taught that Sunday is what you cannot eliminate, you regulate. You know, and it's the same kind of thing. It's like, you know, the Lord was introducing a new thing to the children of Israel, and he took it as far as he could. And then even when we come to the next commandment, which is supply liberally and things like that, that's a beautiful commandment. You know, and guess what? They didn't obey it. You know? But when all of a sudden they decided to obey it, the Lord was going to turn aside his wrath when they decided to obey it. And then they reneged. So the wrath came in full. Civil Justice Code. It is training in justice, and there's several other things like that that can be gleaned from those things. Mary.
Um, it occurred to me that along with the pushing and then backing off and coming again in a few years of the left, there's a combination approach of influence
Yeah.
in between in order to soften
Yes.
up the public
Yep.
for the next onslaught of, and from a perspective of righteousness, this is where um, many of us fail in equipping ourselves to influence
Yes.
for righteousness. And I know I have, in many ways, been caught up in my own issues and problems. And, we need to support each other in going to Bible study and reading and learning and in um, any opportunities to prepare ourselves for the conversation and not be caught unawares when a situation comes up that we know we need to speak to, but
Right.
are we prepared?
And we need to be. I mean, we certainly need to be. But and again, part of it is getting this kind of a message across. Um, again, on abortion. Let's say I don't know where Georgia is, but let's just say that the legislator put forth a law that says no abortions after 3 months. Do we say no? That's not good enough, and kill it? That's what we're talking about here. That's not good enough, and we kill it, as opposed to you know what the left wants. They want infanticide, right? I mean, have they made it any more clear that they would just as soon kill children as soon as they're born? You know, so and that becomes the default if we do not say, what is. Let's take a pulse of this nation. And the pulse of this nation is such that allowing abortion up to 3 months is probably outrageously acceptable. And that becomes a limit that the left that denies the left what they want and saves a ton of children. And you know, and then the next generation. After we have, and here's the other thing. Okay, I know I know I'm just on a okay. We need a flanking strategy. The church needs a flanking strategy. Okay. Okay. So here's the battle line. Transgender, gender identity, all this nonsense and deception that is going on. And the thing is that we, the church, trying to hit this is the wrong strategy. We have to go back to first principles, which is what I began this thing with. What's the first commandment? Fill the earth and multiply. Lucy brought up Malachi. God desired godly offspring. She brought up Jeremiah. Go where the Lord has planted you. We as Christians need to be family oriented. We need to have our families. We need to grow our families. We need to be out there showing the benefits of family, and we need to lead rather than fight. Which means that in our churches, we need to be speaking to our young people that says, families are good. Families are your blessing. Let's go to the Psalm. How blessed is the man his quiver is full of them, because they will protect him in the next generation. I get a terrible paraphrase. But someone says, well, how many children should I have? And he says, well, if the enemy's at the gate, how many arrows do you want in your quiver? Right? Children are a delight. Children are a reward. You go to the scriptures and what they say about children, and they are a blessing time and time and time again. So we teach in the church these things, and we lead. Because pretty soon people are going to say, those Christians, they have something. Back in the first century, they didn't have abortion back in the first century, but what they did when they gave birth to an unwanted child is they exposed them. They just opened up the door and threw the baby out. And there are writings from the first century where, first of all, the Christians didn't do that, and it was noticed that they didn't do that. But you know what else? The Christians were collecting them. You know, that is leading. You know, and it is leading in righteousness. And there again, this is what we have to do. We have to think in terms of what do we do to lead rather than to assault. Because as soon as you assault, you got the, I'm going to call it the nun meme. You know what the nun meme is? It's the nun in the Christian Catholic school that was just legalistic, smacked your hand, smacked your right and left, and is nothing more than, boy, we don't want to go there because we don't really, but we can lead. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Okay, well, actually, my mind, my ADD brain right now is like a traffic jam on 75. It's just so many things went wrong now. Okay, one, referring to something that was said, was talking about softening society, the left softening society. I remember somebody telling me, and I think it was the 80s, that to notice that every film will have some nod to homosexuality, just even the smallest thing. And I started watching it, and probably 90% true, and that's conservative. So, anyway, okay. Then another comment that was made about doing things all of a sudden. I know that the Civil War had a lot of complexities about it. I'm not here to make any statements about that, but I do know from reading historical letters that when the slaves were freed just all of a sudden like that, they suffered the when the letters I had, the poor his plantation owner was just so upset because he couldn't afford to keep his slaves, and it was cruel to them to let them go, and he didn't know what to do. So that's something to be said for what you were saying about doing things a little bit gradually.
Right.
So anyway,
Okay.
and now it's you. Oh, sorry.
So I don't think I was a blessing, Don. My mom told me I wasn't. She told me that if I ever had children, that she wished that they were 10 times worse than I was. And that was the moment that I said, and that's why at the young age of 19 and a half, when I found myself pregnant, it wasn't even a question in my brain what I was going to do with my baby. My mom also told me that if I ever brought home a child that they called her grandmother, she would smack the kid halfway across the house. And since that was one of her good things that she liked to do, I didn't know how to deal with that. So I grew up, and you all know I'm okay most of the time. I mean, I'm just a little bit loopy, but that's okay. I go with it. But I can't imagine. And my mother was a Catholic. I can't imagine how families that didn't have any kind of resemblance of Saint Joseph or Saint Teresa or Jesus in them talk to their poor children. And about the homosexual thing, years ago, and I tend to agree this with the teacher, every child will go through a phase where they're homosexual before they decide if they are or not. Which I don't know. I read it, and of course, I don't believe everything I read. It's just stuff that sticks in my noodle, like you said. I I see that in my students, and it's amazing how I have a student. I call her my miracle. She'll always say to me, "Well, this was when I was gay." Okay, good. I'm glad and it's like it's almost like a threshold that children pass through. It's like the tattoo era. When I was young and influential and getting my tattoos, then everybody got them, and so then so it's amazing.
It's amazing how our themes. Oh, I completely got wiped out.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
sorry, I forgot.
Okay, okay,
Make sure the title is right.
Okay.
yes,
When you first started talking about incremental change with abortion, I was kind of bristling.
yeah,
I am hardcore pro-life. When I first
Sure.
got saved, my pastor was very active. We picketed the clinics 3 times a week. We started with 10 when Roe v. Wade got struck down. We had one left in New Orleans.
yes,
But as you were speaking, I had this complete mindset change, which doesn't happen often. My core beliefs are not easily changed. So anyway, I just wanted to let you know that I do see what you're saying. And I am one of these, like, no, I have no tolerance for abortion or things, but what you said made sense.
it's,
And I just wanted to let you know.
okay. And again, it's just and the thing is, like, you're right. I mean, your fundamental goal is right. We're just talking about how it's achieved. That's all we're talking about is how it's achieved. And and the thing is, it's a mistake when we just draw such a hard line that no one's ever going to come to.
Yeah.
Whereas we can put something out there that's attractive, and then when when there's the buy-in, we said, 2 months. We'll go for 3 months to 2 months. And in the meantime, and see, this is where the leading comes. Because if we lead with the concept of families are the bedrock of this nation, and we turn it around to where families are important, then we get back to the number of unwanted pregnancies go way down because we have couples that are married and they're having children and the children are wanted. So it's a two-pronged thing, and that leading side is just as important. So
The left is a lot smarter than we are. That's
Yeah.
why they've made so much
Yeah.
more
Cunning.
progress.
Mary,
So, when a person, and God calls us to choose Him, choose life,
yes,
choose the good and not evil. And we have to remember that becoming a believer or choosing left or right when it comes to sin or not sin or whatever choices we have to do today, those are choices. And when you tell an unbeliever, don't commit this sin, we need to remember respecting their choice to choose God respects their free will that God gave them.
yeah,
Respecting, and so if we tell people be good, do good, don't abort, don't steal, don't whatever, and we lose sight of choose to commit your life to God because that is a choice.
Yes.
And so those other decisions flow out of training and culture and but they ultimately flow out of our heart.
right,
Yes.
they do. And just one, and we're a little bit late, but just one last comment. Um, on this area, I mean, this nation is right now is so committed to abortion that pastors and so forth that are outside of abortion clinics that are trying to talk to women who are going in and saying there is a better way. They are being arrested. There's this little law that was put on the book several years ago that the slightest little, let's say, push, little shove that you might do breaks the law. And there have been several pastors that have had the most public arrest imaginable. It's like multiple policemen are at the door, guns blazing and things like that, banging early in the morning. And then there are those who are defacing churches, defacing pregnancy centers, harassing and so forth. And by and large, they are going free. Okay. But the thing is like, okay, when they come against us, we get to show love. right? We get to show love. And it does show that, you know, our presence at the abortion clinic, because this is different from a law, but our presence at the abortion clinics, praying, talking to women, saying, you know, there is a better way, saving the son. That's part of leading. You know, so, you know, okay. This has been a long, I mean, it's been a good morning. And saying it's a long morning just, you know, says like this was an effort for me. You can tell. I mean, there are certain areas where I start talking, I get impassioned. You know, this is one of them. So, anyway, we'll probably finish up Colossians next week, and we'll go on into the Thessalonian letters. Okay. And for those of you who've been on the streams and the call, thank you for being a part of this, and we'll catch you next week. Take care.
Stacy's last day. So he's
Have you heard